Ian Collins.
Ian Collins.
On Talk Radio.
It is indeed Talk Radio. Chris Daw is back with us. Let's look at this Colston story then, because you will be you could have probably written some of these debates before the verdict if it was going to go this way. And that is this headline, which everybody's talking about. Does it set a precedent by saying you're not guilty of criminal damage? Does that mean I can just go into Parliament Square now and tear down Churchill because I happen to think that he was a terrible leader?
No, well, clearly it doesn't. No jury verdict sets a legal precedent because juries are not there to decide what the law is. They're there to decide the facts of the case. But this is a very interesting case from my point of view, because one of the things I say to every jury when I stand up to make my closing speech in a trial is, we have had a jury system for around 1,000 years in this country, and it's changed over the years. I mean, at one time you had to be a man to be on a jury, and all sorts of other rules about property ownership and so on. And we now, in this day and age, we have a system where anyone over the age of 18 can be called up randomly to sit on a jury. And the historical function of the jury was to basically represent the local views of the local community. That's how juries started. They were local people trying local things. And if you think about it, 1,000 years on, this Bristol jury, and it will have been a local Bristol jury, has basically brought its kind of collective wisdom, experience. There will be 18-year-olds on that jury. There will be 70-year-olds on that jury. There will be doctors. There will be students. There will be every walk of life will be on that jury. And all of that is pulled together in private, and they come away and they are the only people who are entitled to return a verdict of either guilty or not guilty. Yeah. And they do so, I suspect, in many cases, particularly like this, based on their conscience. And if their conscience would not allow them to say guilty in this case, then my view is that that's the historic function of a jury, that they are there to be the conscience of the nation and the conscience in particular of their local community. And I think in this case, it's a great example of the jury system working as it should be and as it has done for that 1,000-year period.
Were those four people on trial, or was Edward Colston on trial?
Well, I think those four people were on trial, and the jury were judging not just the sort of the strict black and white letter of the law, which the judge will have explained to them, and he will have told them, you must apply the law and you must, do your job faithfully according to the evidence. But ultimately, they have decided that these people did not deserve to be convicted of a crime, and no one's allowed to go behind the jury's verdict. I mean, I'm sure we'll come on to talk about a very different system in a minute when we talk about the Maxwell case over in the States, where jurors can talk publicly about what they've done and what the verdict was about. Yeah. But the jurors are not, no one's allowed to go into that privacy of that jury room, ask them questions, find out why they reached their verdict. It's a criminal offence to approach a juror or for a juror to talk about their deliberations in England.
Even afterwards?
After the event, you're never allowed to discuss the private deliberations in the jury room. So we never find out exactly how they reached their verdict, what the differences of opinion were. But the basic fact remains for me, these are ordinary people who represent our society. They are returning a verdict and they are saying we do not believe these people are guilty.
But I get that, but from an outsider's point of view, Chris, often we're aware that a judge will say to a jury, or a barrister summing up will say, look, even though you might not like XYZ, that doesn't mean to say they've done this, or it does. And similarly with this, you might think that somebody would say, look, you might not like this about slavery, it's about a statue, it might be objectionable to you, but that's irrelevant to whether or not these people committed criminal damage.
And the jury will have been told that by the judge. The jury will have been told that they must not be influenced by emotion or morality or any of their personal views. But in the end, whatever the judge says to the jury, they go into their jury room as a group of 12 and they come out and their foreman stands up and says guilty or not guilty. How they got there, we're not allowed to ask.
But it's criminal damage, isn't it? You don't need to know what went on in that conversation. I mean, it's criminal damage. They wrecked a statue.
Well, they did wreck a statue, but a jury...
Threw it in a river.
A jury decided that they were not convinced that they, or not, hadn't been proved beyond reasonable doubt that they committed a criminal offence. And a jury returned their verdict, and I think we should all applaud and respect. Unlike some of the government ministers who have come out this morning, in effect disrespected that verdict and said, well, we need to change the law then and that's wrong, because juries are there precisely to avoid political influence, not to be told what to do by anyone, including the judge.
I agree with you. I said at the beginning of the programme, and I was merely just asking you the questions for the sake of the point of this conversation.
Well, you got me in, Ian, so it'd be a bit
weird if I did. Yeah, let's talk about chess. Why not? But actually, I agree, because it's the fact that it's the jury system. This wasn't a campaign organisation or some politicians that found them. This was 12 of our peers,
exactly,
men and women that sat there, listened to the evidence, and they decided.
They did, and as I understand it, and they all decided that. It was a unanimous verdict, as I understand it. So, that being the case, it's pretty difficult to think of a group of at least 10, if not 12 people, if it was the whole jury, who would all collectively do something that was wrong and against their conscience. It seems to me that this jury has acted in accordance with their conscience. And if you leave your conscience at home, I think there's something wrong when it comes to a society and a system that's built on not just on black and... the Nazis made laws and courts had to enforce them. Some laws in some situations operate unfairly and operate amorally. And this jury clearly came to the view that they could not, in conscience, return guilty verdicts, and they were right to follow their conscience, in my view.
Let's look at the Maxwell trial in the States, where we know that she's been found guilty. I can't quite quote the specific charge, but was it trafficking?
Yeah, trafficking in effect, yes.
In effect, it was...
Children for sexual abuse.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
I don't think she was...
she wasn't convicted of direct assault. No, it was enabling Epstein.
Indeed. And, of course, this has taken an interesting turn here.
It has. It's taken a very interesting turn because, as I said a couple of minutes ago, in this country, we're not allowed to ask the jurors and they're not allowed to talk about their verdicts. In America, they absolutely are. And one of the jurors in the Maxwell trial has come out in the last 24 hours and said that he, in fact, was the victim of sexual abuse as a child and had used his experience as a victim to influence jurors who were unsure about the prosecution case to convict. Now, that is something which, for me, is extremely serious. As I understand it, he's also acknowledged that I think he's claiming to have either misread or not properly read the form that they all had to read, the questionnaire that they had to read at the beginning of the trial, and effectively didn't tick the box that said, yes, I was a victim of abuse.
Because one would assume if you'd been a victim of abuse, you would have been
disqualified from sitting on the trial, precisely, because you couldn't be objective. And so I'll go out on a limb here. I would not be surprised if this verdict is quashed and if a retrial is ordered in this case. It's an American case, so can comment about it quite freely. I wouldn't be able to do so if it were an English case. But I would not be at all surprised to see a retrial of Maxwell because, frankly, I think anybody looking at it would say, well, you can't have a juror using their personal experience as a victim of the very crime that's under consideration by the court to influence other jurors who are looking at it objectively and don't have that background and don't carry that experience with them.
Why would make somebody say that, though? Why would you give an interview saying that? Because you might think that you would, I know a juror isn't a lawyer, but you might give it a good guess and think, if I say this, I might create a retrial.
You watch lots of interviews on American television and you wonder why on earth that person is talking about the thing they're talking about. Sadly, some people are attracted, as you well know, to cameras like moth to a flame. And, an incredibly high-profile case. And this juror clearly feels that he played an important part in the outcome and felt the need to talk publicly about it. And, sadly, the likely impact of that will be that the trial may well end up having to be rerun.
It's funny, isn't it? The American system could not be more different when it comes to what you can and cannot say. And I constantly try and correct people on social media. They'll say, "Oh, well, look, such and such is guilty," and I sometimes send a little private message just saying, "You might want to delete that, mate," because in theory you could get a knock on the door.
Yeah, we have very strict contempt of court rules.
Is that good?
Yeah, I think it is good because I think if we had the American system, I think the chances of a fair trial, particularly for high-profile defendants, where you have so much. I mean, it's not just members of the public commenting about the case, but the lawyers, the prosecutor saying we've got a really strong case and putting all the evidence up, before the jurors have even been sworn in. I just think that's wrong, and I do think that our system of severe restrictions on publicity before the verdict. After the verdict, you can say what you like, but once someone's been charged, I do think our system, which keeps information to a relatively small amount before trial, is the right one. It's the safest and the fairest system we have.
I remember during the O.J. Simpson trial, David Letterman would do a nightly monologue talking about it. And then the judge was a guy called Judge Ito. Do you remember him?
Yes, I do. I remember him well, yeah.
Letterman used to have the dancing Itos that would come out at the beginning of the show. 5 people dressed as the judge doing a mini song and dance routine. I mean, can you imagine that happening over here.
Well, it couldn't for the reasons that we've just described. And you know, I mean, I appreciate America's a big country, and so you know, they don't have, you know, people watch local news and there's lots of different outlets and so on. But I just think highly prejudicial coverage of an ongoing trial, it's just wrong. But they can't, you know, they have freedom of speech at such an extreme level in America that there'd be no way they could restrict it.
Yeah. Katie Price didn't spend Christmas in prison. People thought she might do. This was a very serious offence, of course. This was driving while disqualified and without insurance and drunk.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting case, because you're right that the assumption across all of that background would have been that she would have been sent to prison for a few weeks,
and I think not for
months.
the first time.
No. She, as I understand it, she had previous convictions. But I think, for me, the interesting thing about this story is twofold. One, of course, is that there's a lot of media reaction. She should have been sent to prison. Why wasn't she sent to prison? Is it one law for the famous, or whatever it might be? But actually, for me, the interesting angle to the story is the approach of the court to the individual circumstances, and looking at what's the point of sending her to prison when we have other options. And what the court did instead was put in place a very substantial period of community service work that she has to do, but also ongoing supervision and reporting to probation officers and monitoring of her behaviour, and no doubt looking at drinking and other kind of factors in her life. And actually, when you think about it, the cost of sending her to prison for a few months would have been probably tens of thousands. The cost of the programme that effectively she's been put on will be much smaller, but actually much more sensible, because what we really want, surely, whether it's Katie Price or you or me or anyone else, is we want them to not do it again.
Yeah.
And if she'd gone to prison, the chances of her kind of coming out and once again engaging in life, that, you know, the chance I would have sent her mental state spiralling and actually made it more likely she may have committed offences in the future. So listen, we'll see what happens with her, but I just thought it was a really good example of a court looking really carefully at a case, ignoring who it was, and just looking at how do we best serve the interests of everybody, which is that she doesn't do this again, and she gets help if she needs it. Which she clearly does.
I slightly disagree. I think you're right in terms of, you know, there's always a sort of seductive line of, you know, you should go to jail for you could have killed a kid and all that business. So I get that, but I think, and this is where we part company, I think you have, for all of these offences, you have to do at least a week in jail.
Well, I think you have to, because that's the worst thing you can do. Once people have been in jail, it holds no fear anymore. It's horrible, it's an experience, it's damaging, but it doesn't stop them committing crime in the future. Actually, just, you know, because prison isn't as bad, actually, as most people probably think.
It would.
Elements of it for some people are awful. Yeah. But others go into prison, particularly for very short periods, and come out just with a little bit of immunity to it, and that. Yeah, I mean, I do. I remember hearing
a lifer, and this, admittedly in the States, but I've no reason to assume it's any different. He said, once you get your head around the fact that you ain't coming out. I mean, these are people that are there for life. Yeah. He said, and that might take 6 months, a year, whatever, sometimes longer. But once you've got your head around that, he said, this place is all right.
Yeah.
He said, you've got your meals, you've got your recreation. You don't actually have to go to work at all if you don't want to.
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because I wrote about one of my clients in my book who had been in prison, I think, for 32 years out of 35 since he was 17. And he deliberately went back into prison, having been out for a week after 7 years. And he said to me, I just know where I am in there, Chris. I don't want to be on the outside. It's too
the institutionalised nature
completely institutionalised.
Was comfort for.
But also, at the far end of the spectrum, where you have someone like Katie Price, a week or two in jail, frankly, would have done nothing helpful to stop.
It would have scared the life out of her.
I don't think it doesn't. That's just not what happens, though.
But
that's
maybe not for years. But if you did a week in there, Katie Price lives in a mansion normally. She's like,
I don't know about that. I don't know where she lives, but
not quite a mansion.
Well, these days she's been bankrupt, I think. So who knows whether she's still got a mansion? But no. The point I make is this: that she's now got that hanging over her. If she breaks this order that the judge has made, the 100 hours that she has to do community service and the other conditions, if she breaks those, she will go to prison. So she's got that fear hanging over her the whole time. because the minute she breaches the sentence, she could be resentenced and sent to jail. So I think that's a much more powerful deterrent than just a week in prison and then come out and see what happens. I mean, that for me is not a very wise way to do it.
See, if you stuck me in jail for a week, it would be the most horrific.
There's a campaign we should start.
I would.
Ian Collins for prison.
For prison, yeah.
It would 7 days
be
inside.
horrific, the idea of sitting in a prison cell. For just the mere idea of that.
Well, I think we should give it a try and let's see if we can.
Well, I often wondered about, I've visited prisons in the capacity of this job, and I'm kind of fascinated by them, really, because
they're fascinating places. They are warehouses for the human spirit. And I don't find that very pleasant and attractive thought, really. That's all they are, and that's all they ever have been. Yeah. They have a role to play, which is to keep those who are at the most risk of causing harm and violence to others contained for a period of time. During that period of time, we should be doing everything we can to make sure that they are in some way reformed. But beyond that, for me, they are just a catastrophic stain on our national life.
And Malta will be one place that'll be sending fewer people to jail, because there's one area of law that they've changed, and that's legalising cannabis for personal use. And that last point is crucial.
They have become the first European country. There are countries like Portugal that have decriminalised in various ways drugs, and of course we're famously in Holland as well, the cannabis cafes and so on. But Malta has become the first European country to legalise possession of cannabis for personal use up to 7 grams or a quarter of an ounce, and it's a very interesting development, which I think we may come back to over this year as we see much talk in the media, and another subject that's close to my heart of finally doing something sensible about drugs in this country. We have this ridiculous prohibition system which leads to thousands and thousands of drug deaths a year, costs billions and billions in wasted police time and prison time, and of course leads to so much of the violence that we've seen. We saw record numbers of young people murdered in London last year.
But do you stop that? Does it all go? Is there not still another black market in the drugs?
Not in my world. In my drug legalisation world, all drug supply would be licensed, it would be regulated, the price would be controlled, you'd leave no room for a black market, you'd make sure that everybody knew what they were taking because it would be on the box or on the packet like it is with alcohol or cigarettes. The problem with the drug business is not the drugs. It's the fact that they are criminalised. And criminalisation leads to huge profits for criminals, leads to violence and death. And it also leads, of course, to people putting junk up their arms that kills them, which wouldn't happen in a legalised system. Yeah.
But you still have people who get messed up on drugs, of course. And isn't the problem that any government would have if for example, this government said, OK, we're going to do exactly what Chris said, we've taken the advice. The first death of somebody who dies because of an overdose on a Class A, someone's going to blame Boris Johnson for that.
No, I don't agree with you, because there are thousands and thousands of deaths a year. I mean, Scotland, Glasgow has one of the highest rates of opioid death in the world. And many of our cities are suffering from a catastrophic wave of drug deaths.
But why would we have less?
We would have less. So, for example, Geneva in Switzerland, they have had legalised heroin treatment now for 20 or 30 years. And if you're a heroin addict in Switzerland, you are entitled to free heroin provided by the government. You attend a safe, clean clinic. You can inject under medical supervision. In the very, very rare occasions when people overdose, there are nurses on hand to give them the right medication. The level of overdose is almost nil in Switzerland compared to the thousands that we have in this country, and that's only because they take that humane, rational approach. And indeed, the Supreme Court of Switzerland has ruled that addiction to drugs is just as much a disability as any other disability, which means that addicts in Switzerland have the right to the same degree of medical care as if they had any other form of disability.
It's a great place to live then if you want to get mashed up on a regular basis. You just go down to Switzerland way. Free drugs.
You're better than that, Ian. It's not about getting mashed up. It's about people with addictions.
Free drugs, though, surely.
Yeah, but the people are getting the drugs here. The difference is they're robbing you, and young people are shooting each other in the streets over turf wars. Those are the problems that we've created with our ridiculous obsession with a war on drugs. And you can't be won.
You don't imagine, just a final point, Chris, you don't imagine, though, that there would still be a parallel black market to that of people. Like there is with cigarettes at the moment. You make down the pub can sell you 200 Marlboro Lights at half price.
Only for one reason. That's because of the huge amount of tax on cigarettes, and they're so expensive that there is room for a black market. With drugs, you would not price them at a level where they could be undercut by the black market, and that would be a mistake to do it that way.
Chris, thank you It's always good to see you. Chris Daw, your book is still out, of course.
Justice on Trial, and doing very well. And you can follow me on Twitter.
There's an audio version.
There's an audio version, which I know you'll have listened to. 7 hours listening to me, Ian.
So, you know, it feels like 7 hours and it's just been half an hour. So it's
It normally goes so well.
It does indeed. Chris, we will see you very soon. Chris Daw QC with us here on Talk Radio. The news headlines coming.